We are gathered here today to celebrate, mourn the death of neoliberalism at the slightly too old age of around 40. Shut up. After a few false starts, we've finally been able to declare that neoliberalism is dead and confined to the dustbin of history. Shut up. Shut up. If everyone would turn. They're dead. They're dead. The death of neoliberalism has been declared time and time again. With the election of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair did people declare the end of neoliberalism and a start of a new third way. But it kept on going. Third wayism at that point wasn't viewed as synonymous with neoliberalism. With the collapse of the Asian economies in 1997 was the end of neoliberalism again declared. But it kept on going. Its death was again declared, definitively this time, after the 2008 financial crash. But not only did it survive, it fucking thrived after that. Then again, with Brexit and Trump, was neoliberalism declared dead and buried. But, as ever, it only got fucking stronger. And finally, with the pandemic, have people declared that neoliberalism's time has come. Whether that's directly because of the pandemic, or whether the pandemic was a precipitating event in a longer trend. So with this in mind, I'm a little bit hesitant to declare the end of neoliberalism or to consign it to a period of capitalist history. So in this video I'm going to talk about why, at the very least, I think it's foolhardy to declare the end of neoliberalism at this point, and at most how doing so risks missing the precise ways in which this hegemonic ideology and system of governmentality is interacting with and changing alongside alterations with the social and economic landscape. I'm going to develop lots of themes that I laid out in this video on authoritarian neoliberalism, so if you've got the time, it might be worth giving that one a watch before this one, or after, who gives a shit. Not the last time I'm going to reference myself in this video, so deal with it. Going forward, we're going to define as a baseline that neoliberalism isn't a system of small government, but an ideology and form of governmentality that is a system in which power is diffused among various different sites, not just government, and, education, welfare, and diffused among individuals in the form of subjectivities, which seeks to reshape the state and the individuals in the name of the market, to uphold and support the market as both an idea and as an actual system. And we're going to build from there. We're going to expand and deepen our understanding of neoliberalism in order to decide whether or not we should consign this deeply embedded political hegemony to the dustbin of history, or whether, like Stuart Hall argues, hegemony is never static, but constantly shifting and reforming in order to keep itself hegemonic. Oh, I hate that. Oh, I do not like that. Oh. Are you the representation of neoliberal hegemony? Okay. Why are you the representation of neoliberal hegemony?
Well, there's hegemony. Because, Gramsci.
That explains maybe 5% of what I'm seeing right now?
Well, you hate this almost as much as you hate neoliberal hegemony. And I'm sure that's true of everyone watching at home as well.
Fair enough. Yeah, okay. Still hate it, but okay. When Trump was elected, none other than the most charismatic man in the world, Cornel West, declared that the neoliberal era had ended with a neo-fascist bang. In contrast to Cornel West though, in my little YouTube video on authoritarian neoliberalism, I basically argued that the Trump administration maintained a pretty consistent neoliberal policy platform. But there are dimensions which I didn't cover as well, which help explain the continued spiral of our politics. In particular, that neoliberalism has two interrelated components beyond what we might see as that traditional policy programme. A commitment to traditional morality and a fundamental racial construction built on coloniality and whiteness. This alters the common understanding of Trumpism or right-wing populism, or whatever you want to call this right-wing shift in neoliberal hegemony. Often people explain the right-wing rejection of progressive neoliberalism, from Obama, Clinton, Blair, whatever. They see that as a rejection of neoliberalism as such. The common story is that right-wing reactions that we're still seeing today are reactions against the economic disenfranchisement, leaving people with a feeling of lack of control over their own lives. The slight decline in white hegemony, made superficially visible by neoliberal forms of identity politics, which emphasises the role of elite representation of oppressed groups within the halls of power. Think Obama. And the funneling of such feelings within the populace by the political class into this, as Cornel West put it, neo-fascist bang. This story is presented in opposition to neoliberalism because, as some argue, neoliberalism seeks to flatten all these dimensions of race, gender, ability into pure economism, or at least to present a world in which such a flattening has occurred. As such, the idea of overt racial populism is seen as a rejection of neoliberal ideology. Yet such perspectives, I think, I know, miss the racial and moral construction of neoliberalism, and importantly miss how this right-wing populism is fostered within neoliberalism, and how it might develop into something much worse. Wendy Brown takes on this question of the rise of the far right within neoliberalism by in part tracking the role of traditional morality within neoliberal ideology. She focuses mainly in the work of Friedrich Hayek, but this is by no means just confined to Hayek, it pervades neoliberal thought. She argues that for Hayek, traditional morality, that is hierarchies of race, sexuality, and especially for her analysis, gender, plays a central role within neoliberalism as the only non-coercive means of achieving social cohesion within a market society. Funnily enough for Mr. Hayek, the only moral order that produces a stable society is the one which benefits him and all of his friends. The problem for Hayek is that this traditional morality is being constantly subverted by collectivist tendencies within Europe, as well as by outside, non-Western, corrupting forces. And we will get back to that later.
A video isn't BreadTube unless at some point they say, but we'll come back to that later.
And this means that neoliberalism has to find ways to reassert this traditional morality. And as such, the anti-feminism and traditional values of right-wing populism doesn't quite look as incompatible with neoliberal ideology as you might at first think. We can understand just how fucking concentrated neoliberal energy Trump actually was as this bloviating, overbearing, over-masculine, misogynistic, white supremacist fucking businessman. And also begin to understand why the progressive neoliberalism, exemplified by figures like Obama, sought to co-opt potentially subversive movements like feminism. To reference myself again, if you saw my video on neoliberal feminism, which is frankly a better video than this one, then you'll remember how neoliberalism didn't just co-opt feminism to defang it of its potentially subversive potential, or to make money off of a new feminist marketplace, or whatever sort of reductive economistic argument people sometimes make, but it sought to use neoliberal feminism to reassert traditionally gendered roles within society, particularly as they relate to social reproduction. This was supplemented by, for example, a neoliberal state which cut back on state-funded care work, which not only marketised the care work process, but also regendered it and placed it on the shoulders of families and particularly on women. So what's important here is that when examined through the lens of Hayekian morality, how big a theorist do you have to be before your name's objectified? Can I get Johnian analysis? Duncanian analysis? JDian? It's not going to work. Nobody wants to do Johnian analysis. I want a better name. What a crap name, John Duncan. It's like, ugh. It's like a falling down a hill. It's like a solid piece of mud hitting the ground. John Duncan. Don't like it. Need a better name. We can see that while differing attitudes towards subaltern movements like feminism might initially appear as a tension between Trumpism and Obama-style progressive neoliberalism, these two strains actually contain within them the same impulse of reasserting traditional moral hierarchies. The difference is how that impulse is expressed, co-option or rejection. One weakness of Brown's book, aside from all the stuff on Nietzsche and Marcuse, which is baffling to me, and of course if something is baffling to me then it is bad, is that she leaves the racial construction of neoliberalism under-examined. This is something which is pointed out by Kudnani in his fantastic article on the racial construction of neoliberalism. Like Brown, Kudnani argues that neoliberalism has been under-examined in certain ways, and particularly in understanding the role of race in its construction. He rejects the perspectives of people like David Harvey, who argues that racism within neoliberalism is an anachronism to a system which seeks to flatten out all racial differences into an arena of pure economism. So many isms there. A lot of isms. In contrast to Harvey's perspective, Hayek's view of morality is not some addendum to the market system, it's not something which can be taken or left, but is fully embedded within it. For Hayek, the market order isn't just the superior form of human organisation, but a specific product of a particular Western European culture, which has to be protected against threats from both within and without, hence the role of upholding traditional morality and traditional culture, and all of which is very disturbing, I think is the word. Through this, neoliberalism creates its own form of neo-racism based on the cultural, rather than genetic, inferiority of non-Western, non-market cultures. This defence of Western culture, of traditional hierarchies, generates its own peculiarly neoliberal forms of racial and colonial logics as part of the subjectification process of neoliberalism. So the subjectification process, which seeks to create a particular entrepreneurial, individually responsible, competitive, capitalistic individual, isn't an ideal which is flatly applicable to all, but one which is deeply racialized as a European white ideal. Homo economicus is being created, but is being created with white skin. As such, the process of reaffirming class power through the destruction of labour unions and encouraging capital accumulation, which is central to David Harvey's understanding of neoliberalism, is inseparable from the reconstitution of racial domination too. The way that this is expressed is through a kind of necropolitics, though weirdly Kundani never uses the term, where neoliberal orders separate those who are capable of being brought into neoliberal subjectivities, into becoming Homo economicus, and those surplus populations who are not.
Significant sections of neoliberalism's surplus populations are not engaged as waged labor by capital, even for a short period. They are unable to be exploited at all. They are abandoned subjects, relegated to the role of a superfluous humanity. Capital hardly needs them anymore to function. Race serves as the means by which neoliberalism organizes and codes the complex, dispersed boundaries between these populations and others, between the exploitable and unexploitable, the free and unfree, the deserving and undeserving.
This is, I think, quite clear. Like I don't think it's a coincidence that with neoliberalism came an explosion in prison populations, not just in the US, but across the Western world at least, as well as an increase in securitization of borders. I also don't think it's because of factors external to neoliberalism that the figure of the welfare queen or the demonized migrant leeching off benefits is such a pervasive image in places like the US and the UK. I talk more about this form of necropolitics in my video on it, which is yet another reference to myself. Who am I, Quentin Tarantino? I don't know if he's a famously self-referential filmmaker. I googled self-referential filmmakers so I could make that joke and seem smart. As Kudnani argues,
to use Brown's imagery, racism is not a monster that the neoliberal Frankenstein inadvertently created. Rather, the monster was already there within the doctor.
Understood then not only as a process of using a strong state to support and maintain the market order, but as a deeply moralistic and racializing process which seeks to maintain traditional gendered and sexual morality, as well as to reaffirm and organise society along neo-racial lines. We can see that Trump wasn't the neo-fascist bang that ended the neoliberal age, as Cornel West declared, but simply the latest iteration of the same underlying ideological process which was kicked off by Reagan. It was hit, no, not gonna say it, I'm not gonna look. I'm not gonna look. The precipitating event for this latest funeral for neoliberalism was, of course, the pandemic. Like 2008, the pandemic resulted in massive state spending and intervention in the economy to basically save it. After 2008, the UK government nationalised and part-nationalised banks, injected huge amounts of cash into the economy through quantitative easing, and the Labour government of the time planned to introduce a massive £30 billion stimulus package on the one hand, while also doing a slightly less severe form of austerity than was eventually done by the Conservative and Liberal Democrats on the other. Similarly, during the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of public spending and state intervention in the economy in the UK. Whether that took the form of the workers' furlough scheme, in which the government topped up 80% of the wages of those in employment, or whether it was the whole £20 a week increase in universal credit, which was introduced by the government during the pandemic. To many, both of these massive projects of spending represented a faltering of neoliberal hegemony during the pandemic, but I think that this is wrong. I think it's wrong. I don't think I'm as effectively using this whiteboard as I did last time. So to challenge that perspective, in this section I'm going to first return to the role of the state in neoliberalism, with particular reference to the strain of what's known as Ordoliberalism within that neoliberal tradition, before looking at ways in which the UK in particular maintained neoliberal governance throughout the pandemic. Much of the stuff here is stuff I wrote about and expanded on in my first ever academic publication. Yes, this was an excuse to brag. Yes, I printed off and framed my first publication. Fuck you. Ordoliberalism is sometimes seen as an entirely separate entity to neoliberalism because of its tendency to ascribe a far more active role of the state in its duty to uphold and maintain the capitalist and market order. It's sometimes even described as a way of guiding capitalism. But I think it's a mistake to view them as separate traditions and instead view them as different inflections of the same ideology. After all, the big hitters of Ordoliberalism, people like William Ropke, were members of the Montpellier Society, the big neoliberal clubhouse. Ugh. They also share key ideological features, such as the need for the state to support the market system, though differing on the extent, the need to create a perfect neoliberal subject, the Homo economicus, and a deep suspicion of democratic control over the economy. For Ordoliberals, this last feature is often translated into a strong state or suprastate technocracy, leading many people to see things like the EU not as just neoliberal, but as this peculiarly ordoliberal inflected neoliberalism. Oh, so many words, so many words. Oh.
I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. He was looking at me with, eyes that felt like laser beams. And he gets the floor and he said, one sentence, which is the one that I'm going to leave you with. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy.
Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy.
And we should remember too that neoliberalism isn't a unified doctrine, but has different expressions and internal schisms. And I think this variability is actually one of the reasons why neoliberalism has been so adaptable to varying contexts. What's important here though is that this significant strain from the ordoliberal tradition, which affords the state a significant role in upholding and even guiding market capitalism, has always been part of the neoliberal tradition alongside the more libertarian-ish strands from Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. So when we see massive state intervention and massive state spending in the face of crisis, that is by no means counter to the neoliberal tradition. And in fact, when we look at things like the furlough scheme, that entire intervention was supposed to maintain the labour relations, maintain the social relations of the market system throughout the pandemic. When they appeared to be breaking down, the state was specifically trying to uphold those market relations. While there was still pushback from within government from people who were worried about giving folk free money and creating scroungers, it was clear that the entire construction of the furlough scheme was to maintain the market order. For a clear example of how this ordoliberal strain is produced, we could look to the EU's pharma strategy. Looking at EU pharma strategy documents, which is something no one should ever have to do, but I did, we can see how the role of the market is still valorised, while the technocratic EU guides and supports the pharmaceutical market so it can better weather future storms like the pandemic. The market is still centred and valorised, while the polity, like the EU, is still constructed to support it. It's pure ordoliberal neoliberalism. So we can find instances throughout both the UK and the US responses to the pandemic which show neoliberal governmentality. I mean, there's so much here that it's not possible to even slightly summarise in this video. So things like the UK government being slow to institute formal lockdown, which was the result of a political and economic calculus which placed the cost of lockdown as being way too high and instead placed responsibility, initially at least, but this is consistent throughout the pandemic, responsibility for managing the virus on the shoulders of individuals. Then there was the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, nice, which was supposed to stimulate individual economic activity, but which instead resulted in a spike of coronavirus cases last August and September. Less nice. There was the tiny increase in benefit levels, and the lack of support for renters, which had a particularly negative impact on ethnic minority populations, both in terms of their housing security and in terms of their contact with COVID-19, a point which supports Kudunani's argument about neoliberalism's racial construction. all of which indicates that neoliberal governmentality wasn't rejected during the pandemic, but was fully utilised, fully used by both government and social structures. This isn't confined to the UK either. As Adam Kotsko argues, one clear sign that the Biden administration still embraces neoliberalism is its commitment to leaving vaccinations to the responsibilities of individuals, some of whom are apparently more than willing to inject themselves with industrial-grade horse dewormer. Apparently, there's a thing I cursed with knowing. Needless to say, what is, I think, quite clear is that in the UK and in the US at least, neoliberalism didn't die in March 2020. In fact, in contrast, we can see areas in which the pandemic might have afforded neoliberalism the opportunity to become even more embedded within the state. In the UK, struggling universities were offered a so-called restructuring regime, which would allow them to receive government funding to survive on the condition that they favour societally useful courses in STEM over less useful courses. This continued a long neoliberalising trend of restructuring higher education in a similar way as welfare to encourage particular kinds of useful economic behaviour. This extension of neoliberal governmentality into the sphere of education is a further way of creating this perfect neoliberal subject. It's part of that subjectification process. And it's, worth noting that societally useful here doesn't seem to relate at all to anything which might overcome sexual, racial, gendered, ableist oppression, which is telling. Maybe most incredibly in the pandemic, though, is that NHS services continued to be privatised throughout, including in test and trace services. The pandemic hasn't managed to stop the neoliberalisation of our health service, which is crazy. That's a crazy thing to happen. It's crazy. It's crazy.
I'm a lot like Joker from the movie Joker.
But it's consistent with the idea that the UK is now constructed in what we would call an austerity polity. This is the idea that the very structure of the polity itself, whether that is a state like the UK or a suprastate organisation like the EU, are now constructed around neoliberal austerity politics. It's very similar to the idea of authoritarian neoliberalism as described by Ian Brough, and like I talked about in that video, where certain things like the debt ceiling in the US or so-called apolitical budget watchdog organisations in the UK are created to shield economic activity from any sort of democratic control or oversight. What this implies then is that high spending, high intervention, things that may seem like deviations from neoliberal governmentality are in fact conjunctural periods, temporary periods of deviation from the underlying ideological process and structures at play. And once there's some stability or normalcy, these conjunctural periods will be halted. And we've seen this in the UK already. Despite COVID still very much happening, case rates still being high, the UK government is cutting back on this £20 benefit increase, which depressingly represents one of the single largest cuts to welfare in history. And this was ushered in with Boris Johnson using just absolute classic neoliberal rhetoric, just absolute classics of the genre.
My preference, my strong preference, and I believe this is the instinct of most people in this country, my strong preference is for people to see their wages rise through their efforts rather than through taxation of other people put into their pay packets, and rather than welfare, and that's the approach we support.
What a dick. To sum up a bit, what I think this shows is that in both the realms of pure state activity and in the subjectification processes of things like education and welfare, neoliberal ideology and governmentality is still very much at play. Neoliberalism is still guiding state action to uphold markets. The neoliberal individual is still being actively sought, actively created through means such as education and welfare and healthcare, and neoliberalism is still my sleep paralysis demon. In short, it remains hegemonic. In many ways, I think the pandemic was a warm-up to global warming, and we're seeing the ways in which neoliberal hegemony will deal with this existential crisis. Not well, is my guess. With ordoliberalism in mind and the ways in which the EU has interacted with pharmaceutical companies, let's take a quick look at the EU's Green Industrial Strategy, because it is quite something to see how deeply the valorisation of the market goes. From the very beginning of the EU's Green Industrial Strategy documents, the single market is held up as the EU's most important asset, offering certainty, scale and a global springboard for European companies. And the role of the EU is constructed as supporting and actually deepening the single market as a defence against large disruptive events like COVID-19 and as a means to combat climate change, which is incredibly depressing. Taking specifically the document titled Building a Stronger Single Market for European Recovery, we can see how the market and market values like competitiveness are held absolutely central in the strategy for both post-COVID economic policy and in tackling climate change. At one point, this document talks about sustainable competitiveness as the means through which the EU will tackle climate change, and it made me see through time. And it was bleak. This is so clearly this ordoliberal strain of neoliberalism that has become characteristic of the EU. The polity is constructed to support the market, clear and simple. It's also somewhat telling, with Kudnani's work in mind, that permeating these documents is language which seems to project a deep fear of the economic threat posed by China, with phrases like the need to strengthen Europe's open strategic autonomy and the new partnership approach with industry and like-minded international partners are even more acute than a year ago. Remembering that neoliberalism is fundamentally constructed with this idea of European cultural superiority, then we can begin to see how this neo-racial logic is expressed within the realms of international competition. I find it difficult to hear like-minded and not just hear willing to support Western hegemony against economic, political and cultural threat. Don't. Taken alongside the EU's long-standing attitude to repelling refugees and migrants from outside Fortress Europe, and the new policy initiative launched by the EU President called, Promoting Our European Way of Life, which, among other things, reinforces the EU's commitment to strong borders. It becomes quite clear how the almost sterile force of neoliberal market valorisation is entirely entwined with deep racial logics. As Western power gets more and more challenged and global warming creates more and more climate refugees, these tendencies of technocratic statism and racial population control will become accelerated in a way which is deeply, deeply frightening. And I think we miss something when we say neoliberalism is dead. We miss how these things are going to become accelerated. We miss these tendencies. And that's why I think this argument is important. This, of course, isn't confined to the EU. The US is still maintaining its strict securitized border control while also engaging in deeply neoliberal solutions to climate change like this, which similarly emphasise the role of the market and the role of the US as the prime imperial power. We should also be viewing the maintenance of US border security as inherently connected to its commitment to competitive energy markets, which benefit US populations and corporations. It's not two different things happening at once, but one horrible thing. Upholding Western markets and upholding the West, and protecting Western market culture, and rejecting non-Western cultural invaders. So is global warming the death of neoliberalism? Or is it just shedding its mask and reveling in the death of the world? Oh God. I just ended a section with the sentence, reveling in the death of the world. I need to get working on that chicken run video. Things are getting fucking bleak over at JTD. In conclusion, I don't think neoliberalism is dead. I don't even think it's nearly dead. I don't think it's in a zombie form. I think it's very much alive and kicking. I think the role of neoliberalism as a guiding ideology and form of governmentality is as strong as ever. The role of traditional morality and racial logics make clear that things like Trumpism and the far right are well within its ideological bounds, and when we properly understand the active role of the state to support, uphold and valorise markets, then we can see how such attitudes and policies are still central to neoliberal polities. As global warming continues to threaten capital accumulation, neoliberalism's statism, morality and racial construction are going to continue to guide the ways in which these states try to deal with this apocalypse. There's a question we can ask, which is, to what extent do developments of hegemony represent continuations of it or breaks from it? And I don't have a full answer to that question, which I probably should have thought of before now, but fuck you. But looking at the UK, the EU and the US now, the continued valorisation of the markets, the authoritarian tendencies, the racial and colonial logics at play, and the continued push to create certain subjectivities, it looks more likely to me that rather than a break from neoliberalism, we're seeing its development into its most vicious form yet. As Yalman argues, hegemony is maintained so long as no alternative rises to oppose it. And it certainly looks like, from both the left and the right, that there is no alternative political hegemony to dethrone neoliberalism yet. Oh, I'm gonna burn that jumper!
Oh, it's sorry, I did a yawn. I'm not gonna re-record this. It's hungover John from the edit. I hope you all liked that video. I don't know how I feel about it. Might be kind of crappy. Who knows? I'm just here to say, firstly, thanks to St Andrew for doing a lovely voiceover. I appreciate that. And secondly, to thank all of my beautiful patrons for all of their lovely work, all of their lovely funding of me through videos and PhD stuff. In particular, thank you to Ellis Wren, Flatulent Jiggly Kitten, Liz Castro, Olivia Owe Hand, Capitalism Sucks, Barney Carroll, Beef Bob Jones, Izzy Wintrell, Sophie, Paul Singleton, Tamash Kispiter, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverley, Sinan Kos, Jamtapot, Nelly Zacheva, Mercutio, Daniel Hughes, Hey Joe, Luke Evans, Mackenzie Ayer, Gary Dillon, Teo Adiwale, Some Dumbass, Callum, Sankara Stan 77, Paul Bartley, Peter Bakalek, Charlie Hallam, Dan Wheatley, James Fielder, Jane Pickering, Tyler Didayo, Alec the Lad, Battle Whisk, Findlay Bewick Copley, Harry Hanford, Jens, Joel, Mackenzie Milton, Nemo, Paul Bartley, and finally Lila, my underpaid and overworked social media manager. Love them all so much for supporting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege. If you want to support me on Patreon, go ahead. If not, you can give a one-off donation on Ko-fi. I'm not going to re-record this. I know I'm stumbling. I'm really hungover and I want this video out. That's it done. Fuck it. We're done. Love you all. Bye.